Have you ever had to smile through a meeting, knowing the person across the table already decided your fate weeks ago? I was sitting across from Vice President Cole Hastings at a rooftop restaurant downtown, the kind of place reserved for investors and executives who wear the same $2,000 shoes. The sun was setting over the Denver skyline, casting long shadows across the linen tablecloth. He ordered a glass of wine. I ordered water. He said we needed to talk about the future of the company. I already knew what that meant. After 10 years building the digital backbone of Hendrix Logistics, every workflow, every warehouse sync, every customer dashboard, they were letting me go. The systems that carried this company from a struggling regional shipper to a multi-million-dollar logistics tech powerhouse, mine. And now I was being replaced. His name was Brandon Wells, fresh MBA, CEO's future son-in-law, polished, ambitious, untested. They thought I'd just hand over my work, train the new guy, and quietly disappear. But no one at that table knew what I knew. I didn't plan to make a scene, I planned to leave a scar. I didn't plan to make a scene, I planned to leave a scar. My name is Miles Carter. I'm 41 years old, and for the past decade, I've been the invisible spine of Hendrix Logistics. Not that you'd know it from the press releases or the Meet the Team section of our website. I've never been the type to chase the spotlight. My work was in the code, the connections, the cold logic of systems that never slept. I came to Denver 11 years ago after a messy divorce and a dead-end job in Chicago, where I was more maintenance man than engineer. My son Noah was 8 then. I moved to be closer to him, took whatever work I could get while I figured out my next step. That's when I met Hendrix, just a mid-sized freight company bleeding money from inefficiencies and plagued by late shipments. They had no real-time tracking, no integration between departments, and no clue how to fix any of it. They also had no idea what to do with me. I wasn't the guy in a suit with a PowerPoint. I was the guy who rebuilt the entire logistics engine from scratch. Over the first 3 years, I designed and implemented FreightPulse, our proprietary platform that managed everything from delivery routes to warehouse restocks to invoice tracking. It was lean, powerful, and tailored to our operations so precisely that switching to any off-the-shelf software would have been a step backward. The system started as a few Python scripts and a half-dead server in a corner closet. Now it runs 7 regional hubs, manages millions in inventory, and interfaces with our largest clients directly through a custom API I built during a weekend snowstorm. But the most important part? FreightPulse learned. With every order, it adjusted and adapted. At first, no one noticed. Then we started hitting performance metrics no one thought possible. 97% on-time delivery across 3 states, a 40% reduction in freight losses, and near zero downtime. My boss back then, a gruff operations guy named Harold, said it best. You made this whole company run like a watch and nobody even saw you winding it. I stayed out of the politics. I didn't care who got credit. I cared about uptime, accuracy, and watching my son's soccer games without getting a call that the Fort Collins hub was offline. I built redundancy into everything except the people. My team was small, tight, and brilliant. There was Kayla, the junior dev I mentored straight out of college who could debug a data pipeline in her sleep, and Luis, our systems engineer, who never spoke in meetings but could write bash scripts that practically ran themselves. They trusted me because I never made them feel like pawns. I believed in shielding my people from bad decisions and letting their work speak. We weren't just IT, we were mission critical. But as the company grew, the faces changed. The board got younger, the C-suite got flashier, and the language turned from infrastructure to innovation. Suddenly everything had to be disruptive or AI ready. And me? I was quietly becoming a relic in their eyes, a relic they still needed, but not one they planned to keep around forever. So I focused. I refined the system, streamlined our DevOps pipeline, added predictive analytics to the shipping algorithms. I made FreightPulse smarter. I made it indispensable, and in the process I gave them every reason to think they were safe without me. They weren't. Because what they never understood was that Freight Pulse wasn't just a tool I built. It was a language only I could speak, fluently. And replacing the speaker doesn't mean you understand the message. They would learn that the hard way. They would learn that the hard way. The first sign came quiet and early. Too quiet to notice unless you were paying attention. It started with a permissions change. One morning I logged in and found that my access to a handful of developer tools had been restricted. Nothing critical, just a few dashboards and internal documentation folders. At first I assumed it was a system hiccup. I emailed IT compliance. They said it was part of a routine audit, and everything would be restored by end of day. It wasn't. A week later, I noticed my calendar had stopped auto-syncing with the board's strategic meetings. I used to sit in on those as a technical observer, part of the unspoken perks of being the architect behind the company's operational engine. Now, I was no longer invited. Meetings I used to be copied on came and went without a whisper. Then, a consultant showed up. Tall guy, tailored suit, the kind who wore glasses that didn't look prescribed. His name was Eli, and he said he was conducting a review of our digital capabilities. I asked who brought him in. He smiled without answering and started walking around asking my team how Freight Pulse worked, how long we'd used it, what improvements were in the roadmap. He never asked me. Kayla noticed too. "Why is this guy asking me about authentication? Protocols you wrote?" she whispered one afternoon. "Shouldn't he be talking to you?" That's when I started running deeper log reviews. Not the usual system health checks, but access logs, credential histories, back-end probes. 3 separate times I found login attempts using high-level admin credentials trying to access legacy architecture modules, ones I hadn't touched in years. They were clean attempts but clumsy, like someone following breadcrumbs without knowing what they were hunting for. The IP addresses? They traced back to an executive floor subnet. It wasn't about oversight anymore. It was surveillance. Kept a straight face at work. I joked with the team, made my stand-ups fast and sharp, stayed late like I always did. But every night I backed up another slice of Freight Pulse to my personal encrypted drive. I wasn't taking company data. I was preserving the code I'd written on my own time, the proprietary modules that predated my employment contract. Another week passed, and Cole canceled our one-on-one, said we'd catch up at lunch next week, which I already knew would be my send-off. Then came the kicker. I received an internal memo, by mistake. It was addressed to Brandon Wells, Systems Transition Lead, and it referenced an internal documentation project timeline. My name wasn't in the loop, but the content, it was all my work, and all my team's. That was the moment I stopped asking questions. They weren't planning for a handover. They were orchestrating an erasure, and if that's what they wanted, I decided I'd give them something unforgettable to remember me by. They were orchestrating an erasure, and if that's what they wanted, I decided I'd give them something unforgettable to remember me by. The lunch was set for Thursday. Cole Hastings reserved a table at Lumen, an upscale bistro overlooking the city's financial district, where every wine pairing had a backstory and the waiters knew to lower their voices during sensitive conversations. We sat by the window. He smiled too much. I already knew what he was going to say. "Miles, you've been a foundational part of Hendrix," he began, slicing into a rare steak like we were here to celebrate a promotion. "And we're all deeply grateful for what you've built." I just nodded. Let him talk. "But the company's evolving. Logistics is becoming data-driven, AI-driven," he continued, dropping buzzwords like confetti. "Leadership feels it's time for a new direction, a more future-focused approach to our systems strategy." There it was. Then came the name. Brandon Wells will be stepping into a new role as Systems Transition Lead. He brings a fresh vision, MIT background, experience with smart logistics startups, very forward-thinking. I knew exactly what kind of experience Brandon had. 3 internships, 1 failed app, and the advantage of being engaged to the CEO's daughter. Cole leaned in like we were co-conspirators. "We want you to help him transition smoothly. You've got 6 weeks, we'll make the announcement after the quarterly. I kept my face neutral, took a sip of water. Will there be an NDA? I asked quietly. Cole relaxed, clearly relieved I wasn't putting up a fight. Already drafted, just standard language. We really appreciate your professionalism on this. Professionalism. Right. The NDA was slid across the table with the dessert menu. I signed it, shook his hand, smiled. On the surface, I looked like a loyal company man taking his exit with grace. Inside, I was cold. Focused. When I got back to the office, I checked my credentials. As expected, my admin privileges had already been downgraded. No access to critical systems, no visibility into DevOps logs, no push rights to Freight Pulse. They didn't even wait for dessert to cut me out. Later that afternoon, Kayla sent me a message. Brandon asked me to walk him through the incident. Response protocols. He said you'd be too busy. I told her I'd handle it. I didn't want him near the system until I knew what his intentions were, but it was already too late. I ran a full audit on system access and saw Brandon's credentials, created 3 weeks ago, had top-level clearance. He'd already accessed the system architecture files, my monitoring framework, and the custom-built routing algorithms that kept our warehouses running like clockwork. He was inside. And here's what stung most. It wasn't just that they replaced me. It was that they assumed everything I'd built could be downloaded, documented, and replicated like a recipe, as if systems like Freight Pulse were plug and play, as if vision could be inherited. That night, I sat alone in the server room. It was, after 9 p.m., the hum of the machines the only sound left in the building. I'd spent 10 years breathing life into those racks, every node, every backup, every recovery protocol designed to anticipate failure. I never anticipated this kind. That's when I made my decision. If they were going to treat me like a disposable contractor, I'd start treating my code like proprietary software, and from that moment forward I wasn't working for Hendrix Logistics, I was working for myself. I was working for myself. But long before that moment, before Brandon, before the rooftop, lunch before the betrayal, I remember the first time I believed Hendrix could be home. It was a cold January morning, 8 years ago. The Fort Collins hub had gone dark in the middle of a snowstorm. No alerts, no tracking, no inventory scans. I'd only been with the company a couple of years, still proving myself, still waking up at 3 a.m. to reboot servers manually. I got in my car, drove through ice and black slush just to be on site before anyone else. When I got there, I found the team huddled in the break room, lost. The old system was toast. I set up a temporary failover using a laptop and an old switch panel I'd refurbished in my basement. By noon, shipments were moving again. No one clapped. No one made a speech. But Harold, the old ops director, looked at me and said, "You just saved us 70 grand. And he meant it. That's when I started to feel like I wasn't just fixing things, I was building something. I wasn't chasing a title. I had no interest in a corner office or boardroom politics. I had Noah, my son, to think about. I needed stability, not recognition. But slowly, Hendrix became more than a paycheck. My team became my circle. Kayla called me her work dad, which always made me laugh, even when I was running on 2 hours of sleep. Luis would drop by my desk with a bag of almonds when he knew I hadn't eaten. It wasn't just tech, it was trust. When my ex-wife moved out of state and I lost full custody of Noah, it was work that kept me anchored. The code was clean, predictable, honest. It didn't lie. It didn't walk away. Freight Pulse was more than a system. It was a part of me, a structure I could control in a world that too often slipped through my fingers. So when they tried to erase me, it wasn't just about the job. It was about dignity, legacy, proof that I had mattered. They weren't just phasing out an employee. They were trying to ghost a man who gave them everything. And I don't vanish quietly. I don't vanish quietly. Week after that rooftop lunch, I uncovered the truth, and it was bigger than anything I'd imagined. I'd been digging through audit trails, mostly to confirm Brandon's clumsy attempts at accessing Freight Pulse's deeper architecture. What I found instead was a trail of internal communications buried under layers of permissions, emails, calendar entries, and planning decks that had somehow been miscategorized and left visible for just long enough. It started with an internal presentation titled Q4 Synergy Opportunities, Transroute Global. Transroute was one of the biggest players in international freight, a multinational conglomerate known for acquiring smaller logistics firms and stripping them down for parts. If they were in talks with Hendrix, it wasn't about partnership. It was about acquisition. I found a date, October 2nd. That was nearly 2 months before I was invited to lunch. The presentation laid it all out. Transroute was evaluating Hendrix for a potential $300 million buyout. One of the conditions? A modernized, centralized logistics platform and succession-ready leadership. In other words, someone younger, flashier, and easier to control than me. Brandon wasn't just an opportunist. He was part of the sale. I kept reading. In one exchange between Cole and the CFO, the Freight Pulse system was highlighted as a key asset in valuation and a competitive differentiator in negotiations. They were parading my work in front of buyers like it was theirs, like it had always belonged to the company, no questions asked. And that's when the rage shifted into clarity. They weren't pushing me out because I was underperforming. They were pushing me out because they needed to make the company look lean and modern, with no loose ends. And I was a loose end, too experienced, too opinionated, too connected to the systems that now powered their bottom line. Worse, they needed to show that those systems were transferable, that anyone, even a startup washout like Brandon, could pick up the keys and drive. They thought the systems I built were plug and play. What they didn't know was how much of Freight Pulse was built outside company hours, on my own time, with my own frameworks, using modular components I'd designed long before Hendrix came calling. So I made 2 calls. The first was to Ava Metz, a technology law specialist I'd worked with during a freelance project years ago. I sent her a high-level diagram of Freight Pulse, clearly labeled with the modules I could prove predated my employment. Start here, I told her. I want to know what I own. The second call was to Darren, an old colleague from a cybersecurity firm in Chicago. I need eyes on Transroute, I said. Nothing shady, just informational. He chuckled. You mean legal but uncomfortable levels of digging? My specialty. 3 days later, Darren called me at 1 a.m. You're not paranoid, he said. They're trying to close the deal before the end of the quarter. Fast track, minimal, headlines, quiet transition. And then he added something that made my blood go cold. They're already drafting the post-acquisition org chart. Brandon is listed as Chief Technology Officer. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. That's when it all clicked into place. The subtle restrictions, the fake audit, the smiling lunch. This wasn't personal. It was procedural. I was an outdated file they were preparing to archive. But what they hadn't accounted for was that I still controlled the encryption keys. And if they wanted to build their empire on top of my work, they'd have to pay the architect. Once I saw the full picture, how my code, my legacy had become nothing more than a bargaining chip in a corporate acquisition, I knew exactly what I had to do. Not sabotage, not destruction, just the one thing corporations fear more than chaos: leverage. I didn't scream, I didn't rant, I went quiet, focused. That's when people should worry, when the guy who keeps the lights on stops talking and starts typing. The first step was protecting my intellectual property. With Ava's help, I filed provisional patents on 3 critical components of Freight Pulse: the adaptive routing logic, the predictive failure response engine, and the modular sync interface. These were the backbone of the platform, and I had documentation, timestamps, original repositories, pre-employment prototypes, to prove they were mine before Hendrix. We didn't go public. Not yet. Ava drafted language asserting my IP rights and prepared a licensing framework that would allow Hendrix to continue using the modules if they honored the terms. Otherwise, any system utilizing them would technically be operating in violation of my provisional claim. Step 2 was building the insurance policy. I set up an isolated dev environment on a secure cloud server, under a separate LLC I'd created quietly 3 years earlier during a side project. Into that environment, I uploaded clean versions of my pre-Hendrix code, refactored, updated, stripped of any direct company ties. This version of Freight Pulse wasn't linked to Hendrix Logistics at all. It was mine, entirely. Then came the digital tripwire. I modified the live Freight Pulse system with a license verification module. Silent, non-intrusive, invisible to anyone not looking for it. 10 lines of code, buried deep. It wouldn't interfere with performance, wouldn't harm any data, wouldn't even show up on routine audits. But it had a timer. Exactly 10 days from my official departure date, the system would begin a routine license check. If a valid key wasn't found, specifically one issued from my independent licensing server, it would lock user access to any interface involving the protected modules. Shipments wouldn't route. Orders wouldn't reconcile. Warehouses would operate in the dark. It wasn't malware. It wasn't even a threat. It was software behaving exactly as designed, and if they wanted to keep using it, all they had to do was ask. But I wasn't done. I reached out to 3 of our biggest clients. Quietly, off the record, people I had built relationships with over the years. I told them diplomatically that some upcoming changes in Hendrix's leadership might affect integration performance. I wasn't trying to poison the well. I just wanted them to start asking questions. Then I met with Kayla and Luis separately, offsite. I didn't feed them the full story, just enough. Things are changing fast, I said, and I might not be around to protect the system. I need you both to think carefully about where your loyalties lie. Not to me, but to the integrity of the work. They understood. They'd seen it coming too. Kayla asked me one question. Are we burning it all down? No, I said. We're setting the record straight. In the final week, I turned in everything they asked for. Clean documentation, onboarding materials, transition plans. Brandon walked around like he'd already won, making comments about how we'd finally modernize the tech stack and move away from legacy thinking. He didn't know the legacy was still watching. On my last official day, I handed over my badge, shook Cole's hand, and smiled just wide enough to unsettle him. You've been incredibly gracious, Miles, he said. We really appreciate the smooth transition. Transitions only work when both sides know what they're doing, I replied. As I walked out of that building for the last time, I didn't feel rage or sadness. I felt prepared. The fuse was lit, and in 10 days, they'd learn the difference between replacing a man and replacing his mind. The fuse was lit, and in 10 days, they'd learn the difference between replacing a man and replacing his mind. It was a Monday when the clock ran out. 10 days to the minute since I had turned in my badge, and Freight Pulse triggered its silent check for a license key. Of course, none existed, not the one it was looking for. At exactly 8:47 a.m., just as Hendrix Logistics East Coast hubs ramped into full swing, the interface screens began to flicker, not crash, just pause. Then each screen displayed a simple message. License expired. Please contact the software developer to renew access. By 9:10, the Denver Operations Center was in chaos. Orders weren't routing. Inventory levels weren't syncing. Delivery estimates were blank. No one could access real-time shipment data. The system hadn't failed. It had paused, exactly as designed. I was sitting in my home office with a mug of black coffee, watching server activity through my secure monitoring panel. Everything was running fine. No data loss, no breaches. Freight Pulse was perfectly intact. Just waiting. By 9:30, I had 3 missed calls from an unknown number, followed by an email from Brandon marked urgent. By 10 gas, my old team was pulling reports manually, trying to patch together a skeleton workflow using spreadsheets and PDFs like it was 2008 again. At 10:17, I received a call from Cole Hastings. What the hell is going on, Miles? I sipped my coffee. Looks like the system's waiting for proper license authorization. This is sabotage. No, I said evenly. It's licensing enforcement. Check the documentation, Section 9.3 of the original integration framework, Freight Pulse, is a modular system. The core components require activation through verified credentials if transferred to new operational leadership without my oversight. A long pause. You never mentioned any of this. I didn't think I had to. But then again, you never mentioned you were planning to sell the company before the quarter closed either. He was silent again, then dropped the threat. Legal's going to get involved. Good, I said. So is my lawyer. In fact, you'll find a license renewal agreement in your general counsel's inbox. Fair market terms. IP acknowledgement. Ongoing support available upon request. Click. I leaned back in my chair. It was never about revenge. It was about leverage, respect, making sure they couldn't profit off my work without understanding the value of what they were holding. By noon, warehouse throughput had dropped 82%. Client service tickets had tripled. By 2 p.m., I had an email from Hendrix Legal. By 4 p.m., the agreement was signed. No apology, no phone call, just a PDF and a wire confirmation. And silence. The kind that comes when people finally realize they underestimated the wrong man. And silence. The kind that comes when people finally realize they underestimated the wrong man. The next morning, I received a message from Ava. They folded. Full acknowledgement of your IP, 6-figure licensing, fee and a 3-year renewable contract for system oversight. Optional consulting clause included. Nicely done. I didn't smile. Not yet. 2 days later, I was summoned, politely, to Hendrix HQ for a final meeting. Cole was there, so was Diane from legal, and Brandon, looking distinctly less confident than when he'd strutted through my server room a month earlier. They didn't offer me a seat at the head of the table. That was fine. I sat across from Brandon. He wouldn't make eye contact. Cole cleared his throat. We're moving forward with the licensing agreement. We want to ensure continuity for our clients. I've already ensured that, I replied. Your systems will remain stable as long as you abide by the terms. Brandon spoke for the first time. You made your point. I looked at him. Really looked. This was never about a point. It was about the difference between building something and inheriting it. You thought this system ran itself. It didn't. It ran because people like me poured our lives into it. He shifted in his chair. Cole interjected, smoothing the air. We'd like to offer continued collaboration. If you're open to it, I nodded once. On my terms. From the outside. No title. No politics. By the time I walked out of that room, the contract was mine. The leverage was mine. And for the first time in a decade, I was nobody's employee. Brandon was reassigned. Within the month. Quietly. Legacy, I've learned, isn't about a name on the org chart. It's about what breaks when you walk away. I didn't walk away with applause. Just a signed agreement, a clean break, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd protected what mattered. These days I work from a small cabin near the edge of a lake. No boardrooms, no deadlines, just a laptop, the morning fog, and the sound of something real. When people ask if I got revenge, I tell them no. What I got was clarity. Because here's the truth. You don't always get to control how people treat you, but you do get to decide how you respond when they do. This wasn't about ego. It was about value, about not letting years of work be treated like a line item in someone else's exit strategy, about showing that quiet loyalty doesn't mean quiet surrender. We all build things, systems, teams, ideas. Sometimes we think they'll speak for us, but if we don't defend them, no one else will. Have you ever had to fight for something you built? Or been written out of a story you started? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear tonight, and if this hit close to home, share it. You never know who's sitting at that same rooftop lunch table right now.